In the 1930s and 1940s, animation was all the rage. Before a movie, you would see a cartoon from Disney, Warner Brothers, MGM, or one of the many other animation houses that poured time, effort, and innovation into these 7-minute shorts. In 1949, at the tail end of this golden age of animation, came Mr. Magoo, a nearsighted old man who refused to wear glasses despite his obvious need for them. UPA won two Best Animated Short Film Oscars for their Magoo shorts, but in 1959, UPA saw the writing on the wall and shut down their animation studio. Television was getting more popular, and animation was beginning to move there, where there were lower budgets and cartoons that were tailored specifically to children. Mr. Magoo became a TV series with a much lower budget. However, the move to TV also led to the first animated version of A Christmas Carol ever made. It's one of the most influential books ever written. Even if you've never read Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, you are familiar with it. My name is Collin Murr, and I've loved this story for as long as I can remember. I'm going to be taking a look at all of the movie and TV adaptations of A Christmas Carol that I can, because I love the story that much. This is Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. Episode 4, Mr. Magoo and Rod Serling. Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol has a few notable firsts associated with it. Not only is it the first animated version of A Christmas Carol, but it is also the first animated Christmas special made exclusively for television. Magoo's Christmas Carol was released in 1962, and in the next few years, TV viewers would get Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and Charlie Brown Christmas. The Magoo shorts and TV show had an assorted cast of characters who would show up, but none of these appear in Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, which is good because we didn't need any ethnic stereotypes here. Instead, the framing device is that Mr. Magoo is an actor playing Scrooge in a stage play, and most of the other characters are original to this special. The one exception is Gerald McBoing-Boing, who was popularized in another UPA cartoon of the same name, based on a story written by Dr. Seuss. And Gerald McBoing-Boing plays Tiny Tim here. The other surprise for those unaware is that Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol is not a comedy, despite being based on a series of comedic shorts. The special plays the story straight, with just a few jokes here and there. The Magoo antics happen at the beginning and the end of the special, outside of the context of A Christmas Carol. We'll talk about this more when we get to the Muppets and Disney, but it is pretty remarkable how many times someone adapts A Christmas Carol with a character or cast of characters known for comedy, only to give a pretty straightforward adaptation. Dickens' source material is just that powerful. Now, Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol does share something with a few of the earlier TV adaptations we've talked about. It's a musical. The lyrics are by Bob Merrill, and the music is by Jule Stein, the duo who would go on to write the songs for Funny Girl. They're not submitting B material here either, as there are some great songs in this musical. I mentioned in my review of The Stingiest Man in Town that Basil Rathbone was not even a charmingly bad singer. But charmingly bad is the best way to describe Jim Backus as Mr. Magoo. He still sounds like Mr. Magoo, but he keeps the songs going nicely and he stays in rhythm. The first song in this special could get on some people's nerves, but thankfully it's right at the beginning, you can move right past it. Before we get to A Christmas Carol, Magoo drives to the theater and sings, "It's Great to Be Back on Broadway." It is a bit grating, but once we get past this song and a few Magoo can't see well jokes, we're in the universe of A Christmas Carol and all is well. Even if you don't find it funny that he accidentally walks into a lady's dressing room, it's very short, and we're on to A Christmas Carol. The opening credits say that the special is freely adapted from Dickens' A Christmas Carol, but don't worry, it's really not as bad as you think. It is trying to fit the material into a 52-minute special. Yeah, that's how little commercial time they had back in the day. So a few cuts are made. The most notable of these cuts is Scrooge's nephew Fred. Some shorter versions will get around this by having Fred appear at the beginning and the end, but not in the Christmas present scenes, and they could have done that here, especially since Magoo canonically does have a nephew. Still, if you need to cut something, this is an understandable choice. Musical versions of A Christmas Carol often have trouble towing the line of making Scrooge grumpy and making him irredeemably evil. Musicals are big, bombastic affairs with songs explaining motivations, and many versions have a Scrooge sings about why he's a miser song. We had Humbug in The Stingiest Man in Town, for example. Here, that song is Ringle Ringle, a song Scrooge sings about how much he loves money, which gets a reprise later in the special when he is redeemed and has become more giving with his money. It's a bit over the top, but it works without making him too cartoonish, ironically enough. The song gets even better when Jack Cassidy's Bob Cratchit joins in on the counter melodies singing It's Cold. Even though this version does cut Fred, the opening scene at the counting house still has Scrooge refusing to give to the charity workers, turning away carolers, and giving Cratchit the day off. On his way out the door, Scrooge is talking to himself and even says the line about one being boiled in their own pudding, even though Fred isn't in here, which is a nice touch. There are some changes made here, but fans of the book will be delightfully surprised at some specific details that are included. In the book, after Scrooge sees Marley on the door knocker, Dickens tells us that Scrooge starts seeing Marley everywhere, including on biblical murals in his home. It's a really nice passage in the book. It was a very low fire indeed. Nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it, before he could extract the last sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago, and paved all round with quaint Dutch tiles designed to illustrate the scriptures. There were Cains and Abels, Pharaoh's daughters, queens of Sheba, angelic messengers descending through the air on clouds like feather beds. Abrahams, Belshazzars, apostles putting off to sea in butter boats, hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts, and yet that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like the ancient prophet's rod and swallowed up the whole. If each smooth tile had been a blanket first, with power to shape some picture on its surface from the disjointed fragments of his thoughts, there would have been a copy of old Marley's head on every one. Now, there is a distinction made in the book between him seeing Marley on the door knocker, which seems to be something of an objective event happening, or at least to him, he sees it very clearly on the door knocker. At this point, he's just starting to see Marley everywhere, and he's aware of this. He's aware that he's kind of hallucinating Marley on these biblical murals. Really, really great scene, and the Dutch sailor thing is probably a shout out to Washington Irving, whose idea of Christmas really inspired Dickens. Washington Irving wrote about a lot of the Dutch settlers in New York. In Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, after seeing Marley on the door knocker, Scrooge also sees the image on his fire. Additionally, Marley, played by Royal Dano, shows Scrooge the wandering spirits outside his window. These are some pretty impressive details to include, especially in a cartoon adaptation based on a comedic character. It doesn't lean into all the darker aspects of the story. We don't get ignorance and want or Scrooge's sister's death. It's not really toning it down that much for kids either. There is one baffling change made to the story here, and it's impossible to talk about Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol without bringing it up. After Scrooge goes to bed, he is woken up by the ghost of Christmas present. This adaptation goes out of order and shows Scrooge Christmas present before Christmas past. This is the biggest knock against the adaptation. Scrooge needs to be shown his past and open up before Christmas present shows him how great Christmas is for so many other people. If you start by showing him Christmas present, he'll just be moody and not learn anything. The past needs to soften him first, or you're just wasting his time. Showing Scrooge his childhood immediately gives the spirits an advantage, and it begins the process of change right there. So the big question is, why does this adaptation go out of order? There's no official answer, but this has been speculated on ever since the special aired, so let's take a look at a few opinions and see what we can discern from this. In a 2012 AV Club article, Emily St. James wrote, by swapping the two ghosts, the script allows for us to see Scrooge getting to know Tiny Tim, then go back and see what a sad little boy Scrooge was. It foregrounds why he's so taken with Tiny Tim to a degree that doesn't really happen in Dickens' original, which requires readers to remember back past young Scrooge's adventures with Fezziwig and Belle, back to that sad young boy sitting alone at his school, then connect that boy to Tiny Tim. It's a fair point, and while I think that the Tiny Tim connection could be made either way, I do see what she's getting at here. And she does go on to write that the change ultimately works against the special, saying that the character development in the book was perfect. The YouTuber Collin Looks Back, who has a great series called So Many Christmas Carols, says,
There has never been an official reason given to why they did this, but it's theorized it was based around the placement of the commercial breaks. Another theory is that it was to put more space between the Cratchit song, The Lord's Bright Blessing, and its reprise at the finale.
Alright, so if the commercial thing is true, I'm not sure why they couldn't just take a commercial break during the Christmas Past sequence. I would prefer that to reordering things. If it's the reprise one, I suppose I could see the thinking, but would it really be that bad? I can say it wouldn't bother me. In the Muppet Christmas Carol, the song It Feels Like Christmas pops up in the present sequence, and then it's reprised at the end. In the 1970 musical Scrooge, Thank You Very Much is a part of Christmas Yet to Come, and the song is reprised at the end. I would never even consider this to be odd or out of place. The strange ordering aside, the Christmas present sequence is quite effective. All we see are the Cratchits, but the song The Lord's Bright Blessing is great. The family sings about how they don't have much for Christmas, but they can appreciate each other, although they do also dream of a year when they can have a little bit more. Now, this isn't exactly in line with how they're written about in the book, as the narrator points out that everyone is thrilled with their Christmas, but I don't think it completely goes against the book either. The Cratchits are happy with what they have here, and that's the point of the song. Bob is just helping them look to the future when they can have more. Also, it's just a really nice song. It helps that they aren't dreaming of material things, but just some nicer foods to enjoy, like Woofle jelly cake and razzleberry dressing. I don't know, maybe they should just go to Whoville. Up until this point, this has been a pretty good adaptation of A Christmas Carol, but the Christmas Past sequence really takes it up a notch. The ghost simply looks like a child here, but it is androgynous and has a flame glowing above it. It is kind of odd that when Scrooge sees himself as a child, even the young Magoo squints like he needs glasses. I always thought the implication was that he was an old man whose vision had deteriorated, but he wouldn't acknowledge it. But I'm not a Mr. Magoo expert, so maybe some of them can weigh in if there's a whole backstory as he's been doing this his whole life. No idea. Still, young Magoo singing All Alone in the World with old Magoo joining in later is absolutely heartbreaking. I bet people tuning into this charming little cartoon special in 1962 weren't expecting to break down crying at Mr. Magoo of all things. At Fezziwig's party, we see Scrooge and Belle in love, which is a common choice in adaptations. In the book, the only scene of Scrooge and Belle is their breakup, so it makes sense to introduce Belle here at the party. Jim Backus also does a great job of playing Magoo as Scrooge at various ages throughout his life, playing the earnest young man at the party, a more embittered man at the breakup, and of course the grumpy old man in the present day.
The child is young Ebenezer Scrooge. You see, he is left here, all alone. Nobody wants him. Poor lad.
As if All Alone in the World wasn't heartbreaking enough, the special prepares to make us cry again with Belle's breakup song, Winter Was Warm. Jane Keane delivers a gorgeous performance of the best song in the special, a bittersweet look back on a relationship that is now over. Even with the cheap animation, the images of nature paired with the song make for an absolutely beautiful scene. This is what happens when you hire Broadway songwriters to write the music for your special. In perhaps the biggest surprise yet, Mr. Magoo does Christmas Yet to Come better than any adaptation so far. It's still not perfect, and there is one issue I do have with it, but overall, it understands that the point is how sad it is that Scrooge will die alone and no one will care. They do choose to make the ghost red instead of all black, but this is probably just to stand out more on color TV. The ghost shows Scrooge the men talking about him at the exchange, followed by the people bartering his things. He starts to see the truth, then begs to see tenderness connected with death, which leads him to the Cratchits. We don't see the couple who feel guilty for being happy that he's dead, and we don't see the covered corpse in the room, but it still nails the spirit of the thing. The only issue with this section is the song sung by the people bartering Scrooge's things. This was added to fill an extra minute of time, and it shows. These aren't prominent characters, and we don't really need a song. But that's not really the issue with it. The song is called We're Despicable, And it's just a kind of villain song about how evil these characters are. It's memorable and silly, but I don't really think this is a fair read on these characters. The laundress, the charwoman, the Undertaker, and Old Joe are all down on their luck because of people like Scrooge not paying them enough, so they're stuck stealing to get by. A lot of adaptations will include Mrs. Dilber and play her quite sympathetically, having Scrooge be kind to her in the final scenes when she returns. I suppose Old Joe, the person buying the stolen items, could be seen as a villain. But even he's not the kind of villain who sings about his love of villainy. Playing these not so well off characters as card carrying villains kind of lets society off the hook a bit. The graveyard scene is done quite effectively here, with Magoo giving a much more subtle read on the scene than many live action actors. After Scrooge begs the spirit for another chance, the spirit disappears, and Scrooge sits in the graveyard singing a reprise of All Alone in the World. Again, this emphasizes the true tragedy of the story. Scrooge is dying alone without anyone who cares about him, and in a version that doesn't even have his nephew, he's even more alone in his death. There are a few Magoo can't see jokes scattered throughout, with the most prominent one coming when Scrooge orders a turkey for the Cratchits on Christmas morning. He shakes hands with the turkey and then pokes the poulterer in the belly, saying it's a good fat turkey. It works in the context of this scene without being distracting, as it fits Scrooge's new jovial personality. This special wraps up on Christmas morning, as Scrooge goes to the Cratchits not long after, and raises Bob's salary right there. It does make more sense here than in a lot of adaptations, though, as Fred is not in this one, meaning Scrooge has nowhere to go for Christmas. There is an odd moment when the Cratchits hear a knock on the door, and one of their sons immediately says,
More likely some poor beggar who smelled our turkey.
"Wow, you're having your first nice Christmas and suddenly you're acting like Scrooge?" Thankfully, his father simply says that if it's a beggar, they will share the Cratchits' food. After the play ends, Magoo does manage to make the set fall down around him, but we accept it because it doesn't happen in the universe of the play. Those who tuned in due to their love of Mr. Magoo and his antics, as opposed to Charles Dickens, will also be happy. Ultimately, Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol is a fairly faithful and extremely loving adaptation of the story. Bacchus is great in the lead role, and all of the other voice talent backs him up nicely. If you're a fan of 60s and 70s animation, you'll catch some voices you recognize here as well. Paul Frees, in particular, is all over this thing. The songs are really well done, and there isn't even an Ain't Christmas Grand song, which is surprising, but not necessarily a bad thing. All of the songs within the Christmas part of the special are memorable, and outside of We're Despicable, they all work well. If you haven't seen this one before, give it a shot this holiday season. There's a lot to love here. Well, Mr. Magoo inspired a whole string of child-friendly Christmas specials. 1964 brought us a much different spin on Dickens' classic tale. Many attempts have been made over the years to bring A Christmas Carol into the present day, as the poverty and class division Dickens wrote about sadly still exist. The story's themes are universal, so a modern-day retelling makes sense, but the results are often mixed. In some tellings, the message will be changed to fit the creator's own belief set, like the disastrous An American Carol. But other times, the creators are genuinely trying to adapt the messages of Dickens into the present day. Of course, most writers are not Charles Dickens. Rod Serling was the creator of The Twilight Zone, an anthology series that often told science fiction, horror, or dystopian stories through a political lens. While like any anthology series, the quality varied from episode to episode. Many episodes are considered all-time classics today, and are still referenced in pop culture. If you're a millennial, you likely discovered this show during a holiday weekend when the Sci-Fi Channel would run it nonstop. In the 1960s, if you needed someone to adapt Dickens' themes while still telling a compelling tale, Rod Serling was the perfect choice. On December 28, 1964, the Serling penned Carol for Another Christmas premiered. Carol for Another Christmas was a movie intended to further the mission of the United Nations. The theme for the film is world unity and peace, and it shows how humans will do better when they stop fighting with each other and sit down and talk. A New York Times article about the film quotes Serling biographer Gordon F. Sander as saying, quote, "For a liberal like Serling, 1964 was a bleak year, and I think the program reflects that." Sanders cites, quote, "the Cuban Missile Crisis and the assassination of President Kennedy as well as the Johnson administration's escalating involvement in Vietnam, unquote, as reasons for the bleak tone of the special. Sterling Hayden plays Daniel Grudge, a wealthy loner who lives in a huge home with no one but his butler Charles, played by Percy Rodriguez, and his cook Ruby, played by Barbara Ann Tier. Like Ebenezer Scrooge, Grudge alienates the world around him and thinks only of himself. However, he does seem to spend more money on himself than Scrooge, what with the staff and beautiful home. Also, like Scrooge, he has a nephew named Fred who visits him on Christmas Eve. However, this Fred, played by Ben Gazzara, visits Grudge to talk about a pressing issue, not to simply wish him a Merry Christmas and invite him to dinner. Because of this, Fred is really a composite of both his literary namesake and the charity workers. Fred works as a history professor at a local university that was planning on an exchange program with a professor from Poland until Grudge got them to stop it.
Your Professor Harris was to spend a year in Poland at the University of Krakow, was it not?
Stop asking me questions you know the answers to.
And in exchange for our Professor Harris, the University of Krakow in Poland would send to our university one of their boys, whose name, even if I knew what it was, is probably unpronounceable.
Kozleniowski, it's really quite easily pronounced.
The film doesn't really say what Grudge does for a living, but he has enough influence in the community to get something like this stopped. Grudge and his nephew talk for some time about why he did this, with Fred arguing for a united world, and Grudge arguing for isolationism. However, Grudge does want a lot of money spent on defense and building a nuclear arsenal. Regardless of how you think the politics in the film are presented, the choice to turn a modernized Scrooge into a political isolationist makes perfect sense. The conversation between Fred and Daniel Grudge also seems kind of proto All in the Family, 7 years before that show began. They also discuss Grudge's son Marley, who died in World War II, whom Grudge later sees sitting at the dining room table and reflected in his door. This is all we get of Marley here, though, as following this, Scrooge meets with the ghost of Christmas past. Peter Fonda plays Marley in these brief appearances, and there were actual scenes filmed with him, but they didn't make the final cut. These likely would have fleshed out Grudge's character a bit more and fixed what, in my mind, is the film's biggest flaw. It is hard to talk about this film objectively beyond a certain point, because it's quite heavy-handed in its messaging. If you're entirely turned off by the message, you will likely write this off from the word go. It was, more or less, a propaganda piece for the United Nations, after all. Still, I don't think the heavy-handedness in and of itself is the problem. Dickens' story is not exactly subtle in its messaging either, and this film's message feels like a modernized version of that one, albeit on a worldwide scale. It reminds me of Fred's line from the novel about Christmas being the time when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. Since the whole point of the original story is keeping Christmas the whole year round, I think Carol for Another Christmas does a good job of adapting that message. What the original book does well that this does not is flesh out its protagonist. We know that Grudge is a cold-hearted man, and we know that a lot of this is because his son died in World War II, but the scenes with the ghosts don't really show us Grudge's life. What did he used to be like? How gradual was his change? Has he always been this way and he's just using his son's death as an excuse? The film seems to lean towards that last option, but it really needs a little bit more. Ultimately, it's a pretty messy screenplay, which is surprising coming from Rod Serling. There are still plenty of powerful moments, and I am still apt to defend this film overall, but it does kind of feel like a first draft. Maybe Serling wasn't given enough time to flesh this one out. I am also apt to defend it because just everything else is so good. While the film opts for a minimalistic style, it looks fantastic. It's directed by Hollywood legend Joseph Mankiewicz, and it features an all-star cast, all of whom fill their roles perfectly. In addition to the aforementioned actors, there's Steve Lawrence as Christmas Past, Pat Hingle as Christmas Present, Robert Shaw as Christmas Yet to Come, in addition to Eva Marie Saint, Peter Sellers, and Britt Eklund. Even if the conversations feel a little long-winded, at least we get actors like these delivering them. Additionally, the score is by Henry Mancini, who contributes a lovely little theme that he would later include on a Christmas album. All of the pieces were in place here for an all-time Christmas classic, so it's sad that it just misses the mark. Especially with those Marley scenes removed, the first half of this movie begins to drag. Nothing is wrong with Grudge's spirited debate with his nephew at the beginning, but since there's no Marley scene, the next dialogue scene involves Christmas Past debating with Grudge too. The first Christmas Past scene happens on a World War I ship, where Grudge is surrounded by ghosts of soldiers from all over the world who never came home. It's a powerful image, and Lawrence is particularly brilliant here because he wasn't even best known as an actor, he was a singer.
I'm not getting across to you, I can see that. Who said only America, sport? I'm the dead, all the dead. We're quite a stew, you'll have to admit. Still, nameless as I am, I've got a terrific title. The Ghost of Christmas Past.
The problem is that Grudge has no story connection to these scenes. Again, this is a challenging point to argue, because Serling's point is that this affects us all, but without there being a story here, it feels a bit like a lecture. Even if the film had simply shown us a scene of Grudge growing up during World War I, there could be a more engaging outlet for these conversations. The film does a good job of this with its second past scene, but it does take a while to get there. Interestingly, there is a bit in this first past scene that reflects a rarely adapted scene from the book. Steve Lawrence's Ghost of Christmas Past says,
Look, I bump a guy in the street. He bumps me. We stand there, we argue. He gives me lip, I give him lip. But when we stop talking, we start swinging. And then we bleed. Then we got problems, like winding up dead.
In the book, the Ghost of Christmas Present is said to resolve fights like this because of the spirit of Christmas. Here, the idea of having a sensible conversation accomplishes the same purpose. After the scene on the boat, Grudge is taken to Hiroshima in September of 1945, where, during his time in the Navy, he went to a hospital and saw injured Japanese children. While we see him arguing the morality of the bomb with a lieutenant played by Eva Marie Saint, showing that he held similar beliefs back then, we at least get the impression that he was somewhat more sympathetic back then. It's an extremely powerful scene, especially when Grudge has to confront a boy who lost an eye in the attack. We see the man Grudge was, and the man Grudge later became, fighting for control. We just needed one more scene of the man he was before this. The biggest missed opportunity, though, is the Christmas present scene. There's still a lot to like about it, but it could have been so much better. It all takes place in a darkened room where the Ghost of Christmas Present, played by a young Pat Hingle, is seated for a huge feast, contrasting with the starving people all over the world. Grudge is shown children starving in internment camps as the ghost talks about how they're all struggling, but Grudge does not seem to be the kind of person who would be swayed by statistics. Especially because we know that he has seen suffering children up close and is still ignoring the world's suffering. So what about this scene is going to change his mind? Again, we need a scene of one of the characters we have met before celebrating Christmas in some way. Maybe Fred is giving of his time in some way. Maybe Charles and Ruby are helping people even less fortunate than themselves. Similarly to the book, we do get the ghost repeating Scrooge's line about the needy back to him. It's not the exact line from the original book, but he says something to Fred in the opening scenes, and it's repeated back to him by this ghost, which is great. The scene seems to suggest that all of these poor children are the Tiny Tims of this story, which is fine, but again, we need more than just a message. We need a little more story. Regardless, the contrast between the haves and the have-nots in this scene is so strong, and the lavish feast feels more and more grotesque as the scene goes on, with Hingle really selling all of it. Thankfully, we get some more story in the Christmas Yet to Come portion. Like with many film Scrooges, Grudge runs away from the present and finds himself standing before the ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. Unsurprisingly, this version of the character talks and has a face we can see, but the harrowing performance by Robert Shaw makes him just as intimidating as the book character. This is easily the most Twilight Zone-esque portion of the movie, as it takes place in a future where bombs have been dropped and civilization as we know it is gone. The ghost is introduced sitting in an elevated platform, not unlike the judge in The Obsolete Man. Grudge quickly recognizes the location as the remains of his town hall. Now, it would have been nice to see the town hall in a previous scene, but it still serves its purpose. Most of humanity is gone and there is no electricity, but we do eventually see a crowd of people file in. They are led by the Imperial Me, an Antichrist-type figure played by Peter Sellers. Even in the future, when there are presumably only a few humans remaining, Imperial Me insists on the views that led to the destruction of the world in the first place. He talks of people across the river, but he also says they need to fight these people instead of working together to make life livable. It's also a pretty shocking scene for early 1960s television, as Sellers quite clearly mimics an orgasm as people shout "me" over and over. Not everyone in this future is in favor of this new way of life, though, as we see Grudge's butler Charles make a stand against Imperial Me, saying that those left alive should talk out their issues, and he calls for new laws to govern civilization. Sadly, he is laughed at, found guilty by Imperial Me, and shot by a little boy in a cowboy outfit. It's a harrowing scene, and it reflects the despair that Serling's biographer said he was feeling at the time. America was just a few months from the signing of the Civil Rights Act, and the violence done to black Americans was horrifying. Putting these words of peace and unity in Charles' mouth was a brilliant choice on Serling's part. And having him be shot down by a cowboy, the symbol for American individualism, shows that even in this future, America's racism will still be front and center. A lot of this movie is about looking out for people all around the world, but this scene shows how ignoring the rest of the world also means ignoring your neighbor.
The ultimate Garden of Eden, planted by man, cultivated by his weapons, and irrigated by his blood, and brought to fruition by his prejudices and his hate.
As Imperial Me leads everyone away to go murder the people across the river, he outright says that they will all kill each other until only one remains. Like Scrooge in the book, Daniel Grudge asks where he is in this future, wondering if he died already. He would not be in shock if he had died, and he has no reason to deny that he has, but the ghost scoffs at him and begins to walk away when he asks. Grudge then asks the more important question: is the world that you've shown me tonight the world as it must be or as it might be? This is right out of A Christmas Carol, and like Scrooge, Grudge gets no answer, but we know the answer. In the morning, we find out that Grudge called Fred in the middle of the night, and while he doesn't remember doing it, he genuinely apologizes to Fred for the way he treated him. They listen to the radio together, where children of United Nations delegates are singing Christmas carols in their own languages. This movie could have been seen as nothing more than a UN puff piece, but Fred does point out that these children singing carols won't stop people from going back to war again the next day. There's still a lot of work to be done to make the world better, and it's going to take more than talking. The film's message is simply that talking is the first step. The transformation of the Scrooge character here is much more subtle than in most versions, as there's no jumping up and down or unbridled joy. Still, Sterling Hayden convinces us that Grudge is on a new path, and his final scene with Fred is very sweet. The film ends with Grudge drinking coffee in the kitchen where Charles and Ruby are, suggesting he will do a better job of getting to know them as whole people, and suggesting that he's opening up a bit more because he's been closing himself off ever since his son's death, eating by himself and not really associating with anyone. So now we get the idea he's gonna be a part of society a bit more. Charles and Ruby are, more or less, the Bob Cratchits of this story, and while we don't hear any spoken promises, we can still gather they'll have a better future as well, and Grudge will pay them better. When Carol for Another Christmas aired in 1964, the reviews were mixed. There were some people, like the members of the far-right John Birch Society, who tried to get the thing off the air before it was even broadcast. So much for free speech. However, the politics aside, many viewers just found it too talky and preachy. Whether or not its message impacted people, Special itself did not really have much of a cultural impact, as it didn't see the light of day again until 2012 when Turner Classic Movies aired it, and now they continue to do that every Christmas. It's also available for streaming and can be bought on DVD now as well. Regardless of how you feel about the film, we can all be happy that it's available. Personally, I find Carol for Another Christmas fascinating. I realize I spent a fair bit of this review talking about how it could have been better, but there is undeniably a lot of good here. Grudge is a believable Scrooge figure, and his transformation is a convincing one. It's easy for adaptations, particularly ones set in the present day, to make their Scrooge even more evil than the one in the book, and that makes the whole transformation in one night thing not quite work. There's a more famous modernized retelling that I'll get to that I think suffers greatly from this problem, the kind of even more evil version of Scrooge. Here, it's just about getting a man who is misguided and cold to open his mind and his heart a little bit more and embrace the loving spirit of Christmas year round. That's what the original book is all about. Both adaptations with existing characters and modernized retellings of A Christmas Carol are common, but there is one more kind of adaptation we need to take a look at: the cheap cash-in. The story is in the public domain, and it has name recognition, so it is common for studios to produce a cheap animated movie for kids and air it on TV or sell it on home media. The earliest version of this comes from 1969, and it was originally aired on Australian TV before being aired a year later on American TV in 1970. Many animated versions of this tale are loving and detailed, from Mr. Magoo to Mickey Mouse to the 2009 Robert Zemeckis film, but this one does not feel done with love. However, there are still some things of note here. So, this version does not list which actor plays which part. There's another Australian version I've seen from the 80s that has the same actor, Ron Hadrick, as the first listed actor, and the credits then just list all the other actors who do voices, and none are credited. So Ron Hadrick is the one playing Scrooge in this one, and in that 1982 version we'll get to later, but none of the actors here are credited beyond just that they're doing voices. So I'm not telling you who's doing the voices, it's because I don't know. This is the rare version that actually starts with Jacob Marley's funeral. Scrooge is walking past a graveyard and has a flashback to the lonely burial of Marley, where he deliberately underpays the Undertaker, who looks eerily like the video game character Mario, before he was ever a thing. Scrooge is also said to have made sure the funeral was cheap. This idea is right out of the book, where Dickens says, "And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain." It is interesting that there are two other mourners at the funeral in this version, as the book says that Scrooge was Marley's sole mourner. The line about Marley being dead is iconic, but I still appreciate a film taking a chance by showing instead of telling. What's weird is that after this scene, a narrator just tells us about Scrooge anyway. Since the animation is so sparse, the streets of London feel pretty empty as Scrooge walks back to his office and passes the occasional group of people. It's also not foggy and dark like pretty much every telling of the story, which deprives it of any real atmosphere. Not long after he arrives at the counting house, he's greeted by his nephew Fred, whose scene plays out like it usually does until...
You're rich enough, bah!
I have always thought of Christmas time, each year when Christmas comes around.
He starts singing. It's a truly bizarre moment because this is not a musical. The only other songs here are traditional Christmas carols, but out of nowhere, Fred starts singing about how much he loves Christmas. It's not catchy, it's not memorable, so this decision is just baffling. Even though it's not a musical, someone must have decided that even this version needed an Ain't Christmas Grand song. I don't know what to call this song, but for the sake of naming it something, let's just call it Fred's song. Another strange choice is made when the charity workers are leaving the counting house. They walk by a store, but we linger on the store and see the shop owner and some customers briefly laughing about how awful Scrooge is. What's the point of this? We cut right back to Scrooge afterwards anyway. When Scrooge is walking home, we have a whole scene of him walking up to the door, and we expect Jacob Marley to appear on the door knocker, but he just doesn't. The camera even zooms in a bit on the knocker, but there's nothing to see. Did they mean to animate something here and forgot? When we do see Marley, he looks more unhuman than any version so far. While the chain design is right out of the book, he looks like a skeleton with its head on fire. The scene also skips a good bit of dialogue from the book without writing around what it's leaving out. We go from, "In life I was your partner Jacob Marley," to, "Dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?" Marley still has his "you don't believe in me" line, but without all the buildup of Scrooge suggesting he's a hallucination. It doesn't make any sense. They just took all the lines from the book and crossed out the ones they weren't keeping. The Ghost of Christmas Past in this version looks quite a bit like Father Time, with a beard and a staff. He's basically halfway to being the Ghost of Christmas Present. The past scene also makes the very confusing choice of combining the loneliness of Scrooge being by himself at school with the happiness of his apprenticeship at Fezziwig's. Scrooge and the ghost make it clear that Scrooge was lonely in private at his apprenticeship, but then we see Fezziwig and Dick Wilkins with him as they prepare for the party. What's the point of this? Still, with all the choices made, there is one choice here that puts all of the other weird ones to shame. When old Scrooge looks on at Fezziwig's party, he calls everyone celebrating, including his younger self, silly fools. In the book and pretty much every adaptation, Scrooge is delighted to see the good time everyone was having, and we see a spark in him that clearly went out ages ago. Here, he just stays grumpy about it. It makes absolutely no sense and completely undercuts his redemption. This is doubled down on when we see his breakup scene with Belle, admittedly the shortest version of this scene ever performed. It's just a few lines. When old Scrooge sees it play out, he just says that Belle should have stayed with him and she'd be better off. Is there no redemption in this version at all? These are the only past scenes we get, and when the ghost asks if Scrooge has learned anything, he says just that he was responsible and should have, essentially, been even more miserly as a young man. While there are some versions that have far too much redemption come from the past scenes alone, this version has none at all. When we see Christmas Present, Scrooge asks him to get on with it, not because he has learned anything from the first ghost, but because he is, quote, anxious to end this ordeal. Christmas Present also has white hair and a white beard, and he wears a pink robe. None of the ghosts so far have even tried to be close to the text, including Marley. This take on the ghost isn't even jolly. He just looks vaguely like Santa Claus and has a deep voice. Additionally, all he shows Scrooge is the Cratchit celebrating Christmas, continuing the utter lack of size this thing has. London has like 8 people in it, and half of them are Cratchits. We often simply see Scrooge and the ghost as shadows as they talk, which is clearly a way to save money on the animation budget. As Christmas Present is preparing to leave Scrooge, there are 3 consecutive statements that are quite confusing. First, after the ghost repeats Scrooge's words about the surplus population, Scrooge says, "You use my own words against me," which is perfectly fine and correct to point out. Then the ghost says, "You used the words." I mean, yes, that's the whole point of this scene. That's why you're repeating them. Scrooge then says he can't do anything about Tiny Tim, and the ghost says, "There is, but you'll have to find out the hard way." I suppose that's one way to describe the ghost of Christmas yet to come, but that's quite odd. Christmas Present then says, "My time is nigh," which is not what nigh means. If you say my time is nigh, you're saying my time is now, not that your time is up. They then go back to Scrooge's house, and the ghost clarifies what he meant about the hard way, saying that since Scrooge didn't respond well to seeing happiness, he will have to face the unmerciful ghost of Christmas yet to come. He was gonna come either way. As we've seen, even good versions manage to screw up the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come sequence, so it would be ridiculous to expect too much from this one. Although, surprisingly, we do get men outside the exchange talking about Scrooge, followed by the old Joe scene, followed by Scrooge seeing a dead man on a bed. Like in the book, Scrooge even asks to see someone who feels emotion about this man's death, but instead of seeing a couple who is happy that he's died, it cuts to the Cratchits. Well, that doesn't make any sense. It took a line out of the book and a scene from the book, but had no understanding of the context. The Cratchits aren't mourning Scrooge at all, they're mourning Tiny Tim, so that wouldn't be emotion towards this man's death. When Scrooge does see his name on the grave, he says he'll change, but we have seen absolutely no sign of this. It is the least believable transformation of any Scrooge yet, because there has been absolutely no remorse. Scrooge remains a miser for the entirety of the ghost visits, except for a little feeling for Tiny Tim, so there is nothing to make us think he'll change. What's more, we don't see him making up again with the charity workers or even with Fred. What was the point of having Fred in this story? He comes in, sings his little song about Christmas, and is never seen or mentioned again. Scrooge's sister isn't mentioned in this version either, so there's no thematic resonance. Again, it's like they just picked some parts from the book to keep and others to be removed, context be damned. Even when he goes to the Cratchits on Christmas Day, Scrooge doesn't even promise Bob he'll raise his salary. So the message of this is just be nicer. It's so vague and bad. How does he even know that Tiny Tim will get better? He just gives them presents and a nice dinner. Neither of them is going to cure his condition. Truly, this version understands the original story worse than any version so far. All right, let's go to the adaptation meter and see where these score. So, Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, despite just filling an hour of TV, scores a fairly impressive 46, which is not bad at all for a cartoon TV special. We get some things that are left out of plenty of adaptations, like The Wandering Spirits and Scrooge Shooing Away Carolers. Admittedly, it's multiple carolers here instead of one boy, but nothing wrong with that. The 1969 cartoon scores a 36.5, which is the exact same score as the half-hour Basil Rathbone version, and only half a point less than The Stingiest Man in Town. There are still two lower than this version, but I don't care. This one has no understanding of the story it's adapting. As for Carol for Another Christmas, it's not a straight adaptation. I don't think it really needs to be scored on the adaptation meter because it's not trying to be a direct adaptation. But there are a few moments that are more or less directly adapted from the book, such as Scrooge having a nephew, Fred, and plenty of other moments that feel like they're inspired by scenes from the book. I ran it through just for fun and it gets an 8. That does not mean it's a bad adaptation by any means. It really captures Dickens' message and themes very well. So that's why I'm not going to really count that as a score for. So these 360s adaptations all point forward to what was to come. There will be plenty of existing characters inhabiting the world of Christmas Carol. There will be modern reimaginings, and there will be cheap cash-ins, and I'm going to talk about all three in the future. Next week, we are continuing the musical trend, but it will be the very first movie musical version of A Christmas Carol, and strap in because this one is pretty divisive. Now I'm going to have some more personal thoughts on these three versions, and thank you for listening to Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. Okay, so those are three different versions of A Christmas Carol, very different from each other, and very interesting for the times they came out in. I was really excited to talk about these because I know Mr. Magoo is iconic for a lot of people. I first saw that one a couple years ago, not when I was first doing my Christmas Carol project on my blog, but a few years later, out of curiosity, I watched Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, and I went too hard on it. I made fun of it. I made fun of the fact that, oh, it's supposed to be on stage, but there's all these special effects, and I made fun of the opening song being annoying, which, I mean, it is. The opening song in that is really the only annoying moment, and I couldn't get past the change of putting Christmas present before Christmas past, which still confuses me, but it's not an adaptation ending change. It doesn't ruin it. Could be worse. So, yeah, I've really come around on that one. I was too hard on it when I watched it a few years ago. It's a really sincere adaptation. There's a lot to like. I didn't know anything about Mr. Magoo really before watching it. I saw cartoons growing up, obviously, on Cartoon Network and other things, and there was never any Mr. Magoo. I don't think he really has much of a legacy like Looney Tunes does or like the Walt Disney characters do. He's known, but it's kind of a one joke premise. Hey, this guy needs glasses and he won't wear them. Isn't that funny? So I was relieved that the Christmas Carol does not really play into that outside of a few jokes, like when Ghost of Christmas Present says, "You've never seen the likes of me before," and he says, "I'm not sure I see the likes of you now." Okay, that's okay. That's fairly funny. And then the bit with Poulterer as well. So it has a few lines like that, but then puts the really big Magoo antics at the beginning and end. So that works pretty well overall. I mentioned it was the first animated Christmas special made specifically for television. And I use that very specific wording because there was a Disney animated special that came out in the 50s, was aired yearly, called From All of Us to You. But it was, repackaging of animation, Christmas and other Christmas shorts, other shorts, things from movies. And it was a big deal in America, big deal in other countries as well. So Magoo was the first solely made for TV animated Christmas special. And I mentioned that Fred is not in this version. He doesn't have a nephew. I didn't mention that he doesn't have a sister because there is a brief reference to him having a sister. We see young Magoo singing He's All Alone in the World, and he draws his family on a chalkboard. He draws his mom and his dad and his sister. He said he writes sis under it. So he does have a sister in this version. We don't know what happened to her. There's nothing else about her beyond Just that one brief reference, but she does exist in this version, even though she's not mentioned beyond that. So, yeah, the songs in Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, especially the ones in the past sequence, are far better than anyone tuning into this for the first time could imagine. But it's not surprising knowing that it was written by the same people who wrote Funny Girl. These are Broadway style writers, and they wrote some really top tier material for this. It's impressive. Really, really emotional in those past scenes. If you haven't seen it, you should see it just for those. But there's still other good stuff too. But just for those past scenes, which I had forgotten just how powerful they were. When we get to Muppet Christmas Carol, there's a famous song that Belle sings in the breakup there called When Love Is Gone. It's in some versions and not in other versions. It's heartbreaking, beautiful song. This one's just as good. And I had totally forgotten that because I love When Love Is Gone from the Muppet Christmas Carol, but it's just both versions have this really, really nice tune, really, really great performance by the actress playing Belle, and they both really sell the scene. It's a really good scene to set to music, have a breakup set to song. It's a good way to get all the emotions out of the character and to make the audience feel genuinely sad that this relationship is ending. Even if it's a relationship we don't have a lot of connection to, because we only see, even in the adaptations with the most past, we only see a little bit of Scrooge and Belle. So a big emotional song can really sell that moment, and it does here, and it does later in the Muppet version as well. So yeah, great songwriting for this. Yeah, Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, who would have known? And yeah, it's not a moral lesson where it's like, "Oh, you should be wearing glasses," and it's all just a punchline like, "Oh, in the future, you'll drive off a cliff if you don't stop squinting all the time." But it doesn't do that, thankfully. It's just a straightforward adaptation. He's an actor on stage playing Scrooge, and that's why it works so well, because it's a straightforward adaptation. Bob Cratchit's great. Jack Cassidy gives a really, really strong performance here. One of the Cratchit children in this looks like a grown man. Not Tiny Tim, thankfully, the other one. Peter is tiny, but he has the head of a grown man. I don't know what the animators were doing. It looks creepy. His voice is kind of creepy too, so if you can get past that, Peter Cratchit does look like a adult in this version. But there's not really too much to criticize. I still think the We're Despicable song is a little bit unfair to those characters, but most people seem to love it. So hey, that's great. I'm glad people like the song. It's catchy. It's fun. I'm just glad we get a sincere adaptation out of Mr. Magoo, because who would have expected that? It actually led to a TV show where Mr. Magoo played various literary characters, and it sounds silly at first, but I haven't seen it to be fair, but it sounds silly at first to put Mr. Magoo in A Christmas Carol, but Jim Bacchus had that really great dramatic voice, and it worked for this, and I'm sure it worked in the TV show. If you don't know Jim Bacchus, he was the millionaire on Gilligan's Island. He's in A Mad, 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 Mad World. He usually played these kind of comedically serious characters, really pompous jerks, or not even pompous as much as just pretentious, needed to be brought down a few pegs. Very, very self-serious kind of characters where the pomp was the joke, and he did that really well. Mr. Magoo's not really that kind of character, but his live action characters were like that because he looked kind of stuffy, but was apparently a very nice man to work with. So, yeah, he's really good as Magoo in this. Much better than it has any right to be. So, anyone who was worried about my review, you don't have to worry. I really like this special. All right, Carol for Another Christmas. This one is not as well known. It's had something of a comeback in recent years, and I recommend everyone check this out. Even if you don't like it, it's an interesting piece of history. The cast is just stacked beyond belief. Not just for 60s TV, just for anything that comes out at this time. This cast is unbelievably strong. Sterling Hayden, Ben Gazzara, Peter Sellers, Eva Marie Saint. These are people who believed in the message that was being put forward by Rod Serling, so they did their parts, I think, for less than their usual asking price. Joseph Mankiewicz directs it. Henry Mancini doing a score. It's just an all-star cast of talent, and all hits, no misses in that regard. Peter Fonda's even there, very briefly, was supposed to have more time. And yeah, Rod Serling. And the feel and cinematography of this, even with the minimalist aesthetic, it looks and sounds phenomenal. So I did a connection like this last week, and I'm going to do it again. So you may have already realized this if you were paying attention to the cast list. Carol for Another Christmas has Sterling Hayden and Peter Sellers. Sterling Hayden is in Doctor Strangelove as General Ripper, the guy who starts the nuclear war. Peter Sellers is three different characters in Doctor Strangelove, including the title character. And they're both in a movie, Carol for Another Christmas, about nuclear war. That came out in 1964, the same year Doctor Strangelove came out. Again, if we want to go to other Christmas Carol adaptations, we've got George C. Scott in a later version. We've got Peter Bull in last week's version. So, whole bunch of the main cast of Doctor Strangelove did Christmas Carol adaptations, and two of them did it the same year as Doctor Strangelove. Sterling Hayden is one of my favorite actors from this period, kind of the end of old Hollywood, the beginning of new Hollywood before it really became new Hollywood. He was really kind of unique person. He didn't like the Hollywood system at all. Just watch some interviews of him. He's a very, very unique presence, but on film, just unbelievable charisma, especially in his later performances when he kind of stopped trying to be a serious leading man. His character actor performances from the 70s are incredible. People probably know him as the corrupt police chief from The Godfather who Michael kills in that iconic scene. My favorite performance of his is in The Long Goodbye, the Robert Altman film where he plays an Ernest Hemingway type, which is a really, really great movie. But his performance is the scene stealer in that. He is just phenomenal. And you hang on every word he says because he's just so compelling. Great movie and just a fantastic performance. Obviously, yeah, he's iconic in Doctor Strangelove as well. And I think as a Scrooge type character, I mean, that's perfect casting. Sterling Hayden, that grumpy, stone faced kind of guy, can't do better. So there's an interesting and ridiculous controversy that came out when this was released in 1964. You may have noted, and I had to double check this because it sounded wrong when I read it, but it did come out on December 28th, 1964, a couple days after Christmas. But, still in that week. So the character of Daniel Grudge was originally written to be, I've heard two different names, but I think it was Benjamin Grudge. Both names I've heard began with B, and it was so his name would sound like Begrudge, kind of a lame pun, but whatever. Someone said, "Oh, you're just doing a Barry Goldwater thing because his initials are BG." Barry Goldwater had just lost the election that November to Lyndon Johnson in a sweeping landslide. And people were afraid conservatives would be offended if this isolationist conservative figure would have the initials BG. It's utterly ridiculous, but who cares? They changed his name to Daniel. I think when Ben Gazzara calls him Uncle Dan, you can kind of see that he was saying Ben. So yeah, people got up in arms about this. Some people probably literally wanted to get up in arms about this as if he should be a controversial topic, but here we are in 2024 and it still is. I am a big fan of the message of this special. We can argue about how the UN has done since 1964, but the actual messaging of when we stop fighting, we start talking, I think that's great. Obviously, talking is just part of it. But Rod Serling he knew how to incorporate politics into storytelling. This is not his best example of that, but I give it so many breaks because, being quite honest, I agree with the message. Everything else about it is just fantastic. I didn't really talk about how much I agree with it when I was doing the main part of the episode because trying to be somewhat objective there, but completely subjectively, yeah, this one really is very much for me. Very well done special. Great message. Fantastic actors. I mean, Steve Lawrence, best known as a singer, is the scene stealer here. He's incredible. And it was Rod Serling's favorite performance, too, according to one thing I read. He just completely disappears as this World War One soldier, and just fantastic. I watch this one every year pretty much now because I really do enjoy it. Again, I talked a lot about the flaws, and there are flaws in this, but they don't bother me enough to stop watching it every year. I think this could have been an absolute masterpiece if it had been given another rewrite, and didn't need to change much beyond that. Just another rewrite, make it a little less preachy, make it a little more character driven. You could have had a top 3 version of A Christmas Carol here. As it is, it's still in my top 10. I think it's great, despite all of those flaws. I mean, you got Robert Shaw is a nightmarish ghost of Christmas. Yet to come, he's just one of the greatest character actors of all time. And he feels right out of the Twilight Zone here, as does Peter Sellers. That Christmas Yet to Come scene is where the Rod Serling influence really shows, and is where the best Rod Serling influence shows. So yeah, I think it's flawed, but Carol for Another Christmas, I'm glad it exists and we have access to it because it's something people should see. The ending could have been a little different. I think we get a good bit of seeing his butler and his maid in the Yet to Come sequence. They become characters a bit more instead of just people who serve him in that final scene. In that final scene, it could be trite if it was just he's eating his breakfast with them instead of he's opening up to the whole world now, which I really think is what that ending is going for. So it works. It deserves to be talked about in the conversation about Rod Serling every time because it's not an immortal Christmas special. It's not an all-timer, but it's really, really good. A lot to say about that 1969 Australian version that hasn't already been said, except that it's very, very bad. There is nothing redeemable about it. It's just awful. It's cartoonish and cheap and for kids. All of those are fine. There are good versions of A Christmas Carol that are cheap. There are good versions of A Christmas Carol that are strictly for kids. There are good versions of A Christmas Carol that feel overly cartoonish. This one just has no understanding of the story. It's just Scrooge is mean. Scrooge is mean. Scrooge is mean. Scrooge is mean. Scrooge says he'll change. That's not character development. This is such a poor understanding of Scrooge. Kind of how the 1938 film failed as well. This one fails much harder and it repeatedly falls on its face. The first time I watched this, which was for this project, and I saw Fred break into song, I had to quickly look up, wait, is this a musical? Because I wasn't expecting it to be. And it wasn't. There's no other songs in it except some traditional Christmas carols. So Fred just sings, walks out of the room, never seen again in the special. It makes no sense. I think they just wrote out the story of A Christmas Carol, crossed out all the lines they didn't like, and didn't make any other changes beyond that, which is why it doesn't have any logical flow. So I'm not blaming Ron Hadrick, who plays Scrooge. He plays Scrooge in this and the 82 version we'll talk about later. I don't know if it was like a Seymour Hicks thing where he played this role all the time in Australia. It's not his fault that this is bad. It's just the script and the animation. So he could have been a fine Scrooge. Who knows? Not blaming the actors for this disaster. I don't like any version that makes Marley try to just look scary because he's supposed to be a sad human figure too. So having him have like a flaming skull head is just ridiculous. I'm very curious. To other people who grew up with this version, was this someone's first version? If you were a kid in Australia in 1969 or you watched this in the US, I'm curious, seriously. If you grew up with this version, please let me know. And please let me know what you liked about it, like what stuck out to you as a kid, because watching this now, it just seems ridiculous. So yeah, I recommend the first two very, very highly if you haven't seen them. If you're curious about that bad Australian version, check it out, but you're not going to get much out of it except some laughs. It's fun sometimes to watch things that are so bad they're good, but adaptations of A Christmas Carol often don't do that because they're just adapting a good story poorly, and that's kind of hard to be a so bad it's good kind of thing. They have to really go off the rails to fall into that, and this does not. You will break out laughing when Fred starts singing, though, out of absolutely nowhere. Speaking of singing, next week it is Scrooge 1970 with Albert Finney. I'm not going to say everything about it right now, just that it has some very, very high highs and some very, very low lows. And I'm going to be talking about all of them. That's Scrooge 1970 musical version, first theatrical musical version. And we'll be talking about that next week. Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast is written, edited, and hosted by Collin Murr. Theme music is Christmas Day by TRG Banks, and TRG Banks' Snowfall is also used for interstitial music. Clips in this episode are from Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, Carol for Another Christmas, The Christmas Carol 1969, and the Collin Looks Back YouTube video, So Many Christmas Carols, Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol 1962. The quotes about Rod Serling are from the New York Times Archive, and the Emily St. James article is from the AV Club. Leaving a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing on YouTube will be a big help to me. I am on all social media at ScroogePod, and I'll be back next Wednesday with another episode of Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. Until then, make sure to live in the past, the present, and the future, and ensure that the spirits of all three strive within you.